What happens when Hollywood's most iconic tough guy comes face to face with daytime television's most polarizing panel? You won't believe what unfolds when Clint Eastwood sits down with the View hosts for what was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance. The explosive confrontation that erupted on live television last night has everyone talking, and the shocking moment when one of cinema's greatest legends stormed off set will leave you speechless. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these worlds collide in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The atmosphere in the View studio was already charged with an undercurrent of tension as the cameras rolled for what producers had billed as a light-hearted segment with the legendary actor and director. Clint Eastwood, at 94 years old, had agreed to appear on the show to discuss his latest project and reflect on his decades-long career in Hollywood. The hosts, including Whoopi Goldberg, Joy Behar, Sarah Haynes, Sunny Hostin, and Alyssa Farah Griffin, had prepared what they believed would be standard questions about his filmography and upcoming work. But from the moment Eastwood walked onto the set, something felt different. The usually composed icon carried himself with an air of quiet defiance, his steely gaze scanning the panel with the same intensity he brought to his most memorable film roles. The audience applauded warmly, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air that seemed to electrify the studio. Whoopi Goldberg, serving as the primary interviewer, opened with what appeared to be a softball question about Eastwood's enduring appeal and his ability to connect with audiences across multiple generations. Eastwood's response was measured but carried an edge that immediately put the hosts on alert. "I've always believed in telling stories that matter," he said, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone. "Stories that don't pander to whatever's popular this week, but speak to something deeper in the human experience." The comment seemed innocuous enough, but Joy Behar, never one to let a potential dig slide, immediately picked up on what she perceived as a subtle criticism. "Are you suggesting that some stories today are just pandering?" she asked, her tone already sharpening. "Because I think audiences are more sophisticated than ever, and they want content that reflects their values and experiences." Eastwood's eyes narrowed slightly, and those watching closely could see the first signs of the storm that was about to break. "I'm saying that when you start making movies or telling stories based on focus groups and social media trends instead of authentic human experience, you lose something essential," he replied, his voice remaining steady but carrying an unmistakable warning. The tension in the studio was palpable now, and the other hosts began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah Haynes attempted to steer the conversation back to safer territory by asking about Eastwood's directing process, but Sunny Hostin had clearly been triggered by his previous comments. "I think what some people call authentic human experience is really just a code word for excluding voices that haven't traditionally been heard," she interjected, her voice rising slightly. "The film industry has evolved, and thank goodness for that." The veteran actor's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the studio fell silent except for the hum of the cameras. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of decades in Hollywood and a lifetime of refusing to back down from anyone. "I've been making movies since before you were born," he said, his gaze fixed directly on Hostin. "I've worked with people of every background, every race, every walk of life. Don't lecture me about inclusion when you don't know what you're talking about." The audience gasped audibly, and the hosts exchanged glances that spoke volumes about how quickly this interview was spiraling out of control. Alyssa Farah Griffin, perhaps sensing an opportunity to gain some ground, jumped in with a question about Eastwood's political views and how they might have influenced his filmmaking choices over the years. It was a calculated move, but one that would prove to be the spark that ignited the powder keg. Eastwood's response was immediate and unflinching. "My politics are my business," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that anyone who had watched his films would recognize. "But I will say this. I've never let political correctness dictate what stories I tell or how I tell them. If that bothers people, they don't have to watch." Joy Behar, her face flushed with indignation, leaned forward aggressively. "But don't you think artists have a responsibility to use their platform to promote positive social change?" she demanded. "Especially someone with your influence and reach?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the studio seemed to hold their breath waiting for Eastwood's response. The legendary actor's eyes flashed with an anger that had been building since the interview began, and his voice, when he finally spoke, carried the unmistakable tone of a man who had reached his limit. "I think artists have a responsibility to tell the truth," he said, each word delivered with deliberate precision. "Not to promote whatever agenda happens to be fashionable at the moment. Real artists don't take orders from talk show hosts about what they should or shouldn't create." The insult hit its mark, and the host's faces registered shock and outrage in equal measure. The studio audience, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented, began to murmur among themselves, their excitement building as they realized they were watching television history unfold in real time. Whoopi Goldberg, her composure finally cracking, attempted to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Eastwood, I think we're getting a little off track here," she said, her voice strained. "With the effort of maintaining professionalism, we invited you here to talk about your work, not to attack our show or our approach to discussing important issues." But Eastwood was far from finished, and the fire in his eyes suggested that the worst was yet to come. The battle lines had been drawn, and as the tension reached a breaking point, it became clear that this confrontation was about to escalate into something none of them had ever experienced before on live television: the silence that followed Whoopi's attempt at damage. Control lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity to everyone in the studio. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every micro-expression, every subtle shift in body language that signaled the approaching storm. Eastwood's weathered hands gripped the arms of his chair with white-knuckled intensity, and his legendary composure was beginning to crack in a way that none of his films had ever prepared audiences to witness. "Attack your show?" Eastwood's voice cut through the tension like a blade, each word dripping with decades of accumulated frustration. "Lady, I haven't even gotten started yet. You want to talk about attacks? Let's talk about how you people have spent the last hour trying to bait me into saying something you can use to destroy me on social media tomorrow." The accusation hit the panel like a physical blow, and the host's carefully constructed facade of professional courtesy began to crumble. Joy Behar, her face now flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment, shot back with venom that surprised even her colleagues. "Nobody's trying to destroy you, Mr. Eastwood. We're trying to have an honest conversation about responsibility and accountability in the entertainment industry." Eastwood's laugh was harsh and bitter, a sound that seemed to echo through the studio with unsettling resonance. "Responsibility? You want to lecture me about responsibility?" His voice rose for the first time since the interview began, and the raw power behind it made several audience members visibly flinch. "I've been responsible for creating jobs for thousands of people, for telling stories that actually matter, for building a career based on merit instead of political connections and virtue signaling." The words hung in the air like an explosive charge, and Sunny Hostin, her professional demeanor completely abandoned, leaned forward with barely contained fury. "Virtue signaling? Is that what you call standing up for marginalized communities? Is that what you call using your platform to make the world a better place?" The veteran actor's response was immediate and devastating. "I call it grandstanding," he said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority and experience. "I call it performative nonsense from people who've never created anything of lasting value, never taken a real risk, never put their money where their mouth is. You sit here in your comfortable chairs, collecting your paychecks, and pretend you're changing the world by lecturing people who've actually done something with their lives." The studio audience was now completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of daytime television. The hosts exchanged frantic glances, clearly struggling to process the verbal assault that had just been unleashed upon them. But Eastwood wasn't finished, and his next words would push the confrontation past the point of no return. "You know what really gets me?" he continued, his voice now carrying a dangerous edge that made everyone in the room acutely aware of the legendary temper that had been the subject of Hollywood folklore for decades. "It's the arrogance, the absolute arrogance of thinking that, because you have a television show, you somehow have the right to sit in judgment of people who've spent their entire lives perfecting their craft." Sarah Haynes, who had been largely silent during the escalating conflict, finally found her voice, though it trembled with a mixture of fear and indignation. We're not sitting in judgment of anyone, Mr. Eastwood. We're simply asking questions that our viewers want answers to. Questions about how entertainment shapes culture and society. Eastwood's response was swift and merciless. Your viewers, he said, the words dripping with contempt, are being fed a steady diet of manufactured outrage and political propaganda disguised as entertainment news. You're not informing anyone about anything. You're dividing people, creating conflict where none needs to exist, and profiting from the chaos you create. The accusation struck at the very heart of what The View represented, and the host's reactions were immediate and visceral. Whoopi Goldberg, abandoning any pretense of professional neutrality, slammed her hand down on the table with enough force to make the microphones jump. "That is enough," she shouted, her voice echoing through the studio. "You came on our show, Mr. Eastwood. Nobody forced you to be here. If you don't like what we do, if you don't respect what we do, then why are you here?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Eastwood's response would mark the moment when the confrontation moved from heated discussion to all-out war. He stood up slowly, his full height and presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded respect from everyone from studio executives to world leaders. "I'm here," he said, his words measured and deliberate, "because I was told this would be a conversation about my work, my career, and my contributions to American cinema. Instead, I walked into an ambush by a group of people who seemed to think their political opinions are more important than the art that's defined my life for 7 decades. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the mechanical hum of the cameras that continued to capture every moment of the unprecedented confrontation. The hosts sat frozen, clearly unprepared for the level of resistance they were encountering from their guest. But the worst was yet to come, and as Eastwood's anger reached its peak, it became clear that this war of words was about to reach a climax that would shock everyone watching. Alyssa Farah Griffin, perhaps sensing that the situation had spiraled completely out of control, made a desperate attempt to salvage what remained of the interview. "Mr. Eastwood, I think we can all agree that there's been some miscommunication here," she said, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining diplomatic composure. "Maybe we can find some common ground and have a productive conversation about your incredible body of work." But Eastwood's response crushed any hope of reconciliation with brutal efficiency. "Common ground," he repeated, his voice laden with disdain. "The only common ground I see here is a shared commitment to tearing down everything that made this country great. You people represent everything that's wrong with modern media, modern Hollywood, and modern discourse." The words hit the panel like a series of explosive charges, and Joy Behar, her face now crimson with rage, abandoned all pretense of civility. "How dare you come on our show and insult us like this?" she screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "We've been nothing but respectful to you, and you've been attacking us from the moment you sat down." Eastwood's laugh was cold and humorless, a sound that seemed to chill the very air in the studio. "Respectful," he said, his voice rising to match her intensity. "You call ambushing a guest with loaded political questions respectful? You call trying to trap me into saying something you can use against me respectful? Lady, you wouldn't know respect if it walked up and introduced itself." The insult was devastating in its simplicity, and the effect on the hosts was immediate and dramatic. Sunny Hostin, her professional composure completely shattered, stood up from her chair with such force that it nearly toppled over. "That's it," she shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at the legendary actor. "I don't care who you are or what you've accomplished. You don't get to come on our show and treat us like this." The confrontation had now reached a fever pitch, with voices raised and emotions running completely unchecked. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, watching as one of Hollywood's most respected figures engaged in an all-out war with one of daytime television's most popular shows. But Eastwood wasn't finished, and his next words would deliver the final, crushing blow. "You want to know what I really think?" he said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his legendary authority. "I think you're a bunch of failed performers who couldn't make it in real entertainment, so you settled for sitting around a table gossiping about your betters. I think you're parasites who feed off the work of real artists, real creators, real Americans who actually contribute something meaningful to society." The accusation was so brutal so completely devastating that it seemed to suck all the air out of the room. The hosts sat in stunned silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, rage, and something that looked disturbingly like recognition. But Eastwood wasn't finished delivering his verdict. "I've spent my entire life creating things that matter," he continued, his voice now carrying the passion of someone defending everything he held sacred. "Movies that inspire people, stories that explore the human condition, characters that represent the best of what we can be. And you people think you have the right to sit in judgment of that work because you have a television show?" Whoopi Goldberg, her face now a mask of barely controlled fury, made one final attempt to assert control over the situation. "Mr. Eastwood, I think it's time for you to leave," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "This interview is over." But Eastwood was already moving, pushing back from the table with the deliberate movements of a man who had made his decision. "You're damn right it's over," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "I've wasted enough time trying to have a civilized conversation with people who wouldn't recognize civilization if it bit them on the ass." The studio erupted in chaos as the legendary actor began to remove his microphone, his movements sharp and decisive. The hosts sat in stunned silence, clearly unprepared for the speed and determination with which their guest was making his exit. But Eastwood wasn't finished delivering his final judgment. "You know what the real tragedy is?" he said, turning back to face the panel one last time. "You had the chance to have a real conversation with someone who's actually lived through the history you pretend to understand. Instead, you chose to play your petty political games and grandstand for your cameras. That's not journalism. That's not entertainment. That's just sad." The words hung in the air like a final verdict, and the effect on the studio was immediate and profound. The audience sat in complete silence, witnessing the end of what would undoubtedly go down as one of the most explosive confrontations in television history. The hosts, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, anger, and something that looked disturbingly like defeat, could only watch as their guest delivered his final blow. "I've been making movies for longer than this show has existed," Eastwood said, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I'll be making movies long after it's canceled. But you people will always be exactly what you are right now: failed performers sitting around a table, gossiping about your betters, and pretending it matters." With that final, devastating assessment, Clint Eastwood turned his back on the panel and walked off the set with the purposeful stride of a man who had said exactly what he came to say. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the silent studio, each step marking the end of an interview that had transformed from a routine promotional appearance into television history. The cameras continued to roll, capturing the stunned faces of the hosts and the shocked silence of the audience. In the space of 30 minutes, one of Hollywood's most legendary figures had systematically dismantled one of daytime television's most powerful platforms, leaving behind a trail of devastation that would be talked about for years to come. As the studio doors closed behind the departing legend, the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. The View had hosted thousands of guests over the years, but none had ever delivered such a complete and devastating critique of everything the show represented. The confrontation was over, but the impact of Eastwood's words would reverberate through the entertainment industry for years to come.